Dr. Marcus Elliot stared at the shimmering blue liquid in the vial, the culmination of 11 months of secret research. The laboratory's harsh lighting reflected off the glass, casting cobalt patterns across his face as doubt crept through his mind. "This is insane," he muttered, running a hand through his disheveled dark hair. "Completely unethical." Yet he couldn't bring himself to dispose of the compound. Not when it represented his only chance with Eliza. Eliza Vaughn had joined Horizon Laboratories' Astrophysics Division last year, and Marcus had fallen for her almost immediately. It wasn't just her striking appearance, though her copper hair and penetrating green eyes certainly hadn't hurt, but her brilliant mind that captivated him. The way she could dissect complex celestial phenomena, her innovative approach to quantum theory, the little smile that played on her lips when she solved a particularly challenging equation. He was hopelessly entranced. And completely invisible to her. Marcus swirled the compound gently. Pheromone science had advanced dramatically in recent years, but his innovation went further, incorporating elements from his astrophysics background, specifically, the gravitational pull theory he'd been developing. The compound was designed to create an attraction field, enhancing natural chemistry between two people. Harmless, temporary, and subtle, or so his models predicted. He slipped the vial into his lab coat pocket as the door opened. "Working late again, Marcus?" Eliza appeared in the doorway, her lab coat unbuttoned over a simple blouse and pencil skirt. "The conference presentation is in 2 weeks. We should compare notes." His heart hammered against his ribs. "Sure, I've been reviewing the data on stellar magnetism." She moved to his workstation, standing close enough that he could smell her perfume, something with notes of vanilla and spice. "I've been thinking about your gravitational theory. It's revolutionary, but I think you're missing something in the attraction variables." Attraction variables. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Maybe we could discuss it over coffee sometime?" The words escaped before he could stop them, the same invitation she'd politely declined 3 times before. Her smile was kind but distant. "Let's focus on the presentation for now." As they worked, Marcus found himself reaching for the vial repeatedly, then withdrawing his hand. This was wrong. Manipulating someone's feelings was reprehensible. But was that what he was doing? The compound would only enhance existing attraction, not create it from nothing. If there was truly nothing there. "What's that you keep touching in your pocket?" Eliza asked, breaking his internal debate. Startled, Marcus accidentally pulled out the vial. "Oh, just a synthetic stellar material sample." Her eyes lit with scientific curiosity. "May I see?" Before he could object, she took the uncapped vial, examining it under the light. "Fascinating color. What's its composition?" As she handed it back, the liquid sloshed, releasing an invisible mist. Eliza breathed it in before either of them realized what had happened. "Sorry, Marcus began, panic rising. But Eliza didn't seem concerned. She blinked, her pupils dilating slightly. "No harm done." "Where were we?" They returned to work, but something had changed. Eliza moved closer, her shoulder occasionally brushing his. When their hands touched reaching for the same data tablet, she didn't pull away immediately. "You know," she said after an hour of increasingly charged proximity, "I've never really looked at your research from this angle before. It's compelling." Her eyes met his, lingering longer than they ever had. Something smoldered there, interest, curiosity, desire. "Maybe we should continue this discussion over dinner," she suggested, her voice lower than usual. Marcus froze. This was happening too fast. The compound was supposed to be subtle, a gentle nudge toward awareness, not this rapid shift. "Now," he managed. Eliza smiled, a new heat in her expression. "Unless you have something better to do tonight?" As she gathered her things, Marcus watched in stunned silence. What had he done? The dosage must have been wrong, far too potent. He needed to tell her, to confess everything. But as Eliza looked back at him from the doorway, her eyes reflecting an unmistakable want that he'd dreamed of seeing for nearly a year, the words died in his throat. "Coming?" she asked. Marcus nodded and followed, the empty vial burning a hole of guilt in his pocket as they stepped into the night together. The restaurant was dimly lit, casting a warm glow across Eliza's face as she leaned forward, hanging on Marcus's every word. 3 glasses of wine into dinner, and her hand had found its way across the table to rest on his. "I never realized how fascinating your research on gravitational fields truly is," she said, her thumb tracing circles on his wrist. "The way you describe stellar attraction, it's almost poetic." Marcus swallowed hard. He'd dreamed of this moment, Eliza looking at him with those emerald eyes full of desire, but the vial in his pocket had turned dream into nightmare. This wasn't real. Or was it? The compound was only supposed to enhance existing attraction, not create it from nothing. "Eliza, maybe we should slow down," he suggested, though his body betrayed him, leaning closer to her. She smiled, a predatory edge to her expression he'd never seen before. "We've been slowing down for nearly a year, Marcus. All those little moments in the lab, the lingering glances, don't pretend you haven't felt it too." Had there been lingering glances? Marcus couldn't remember any from her side, but doubt crept in. Had he been so focused on his own unrequited feelings that he'd missed signals from her? "Let's get out of here," Eliza whispered, her voice husky. "My apartment is just 3 blocks away." Outside, the cool night air did nothing to dampen the heat between them. Eliza pressed Marcus against the brick wall of the restaurant, her lips finding his with startling intensity. The kiss consumed him, everything he'd imagined and more. His hands found their way to her waist, pulling her closer despite the voice in his head screaming that this wasn't right. "I've wanted to do that for months," she breathed against his mouth. "Have you?" he asked, genuinely curious now. "Of course. Why do you think I kept finding reasons to collaborate on projects?" She took his hand, leading him toward her apartment. "I was beginning to think you weren't interested." Marcus's mind raced. Had she been showing interest all along? No, that couldn't be right. He'd asked her out 3 times, and she'd gently deflected each attempt. In her apartment, Eliza wasted no time. As soon as the door closed, she was unbuttoning his shirt, her mouth hot against his neck. "I've imagined this so many times," she murmured. Guilt and desire warred within Marcus as they stumbled toward her bedroom. Her intensity was intoxicating, but he couldn't shake the knowledge that this sudden passion might be chemically induced. When she pushed him onto the bed and straddled him, her copper hair falling around them like a curtain, his resistance crumbled. Their bodies came together with an urgency that left them both gasping. Eliza moved with abandon, whispering things that made his skin flush. Her nails dug into his shoulders as she took what she wanted from him, her eyes never leaving his. When they finally collapsed together, sweaty and satisfied, Marcus felt both elated and hollow. That was. Eliza trailed off, curling against his side. Unexpected, Marcus finished, staring at the ceiling. She laughed, the sound lighter than he'd ever heard from her. Only in its timing. "The chemistry between us has been obvious to everyone at the lab." Had it? Marcus tried to recall any knowing looks or comments from colleagues but came up empty. Morning arrived with sunlight streaming through Eliza's bedroom curtains. Marcus awoke to find her watching him, a soft smile on her lips. "Morning," she said, pressing a kiss to his shoulder. "I made coffee already." This domesticity felt surreal. Just 24 hours ago, they had been colleagues with a professional relationship. Now, in the harsh light of day, Marcus's guilt intensified. He needed to run tests, determine how long the compound would remain active in her system. He needed to confess. "Eliza, about last night." Don't you dare say it was a mistake, she interrupted, suddenly fierce. This has been building between us for too long to dismiss. I wasn't going to say that, he lied. I just need to get to the lab. There's something I need to check on my project. Her expression shifted from concern to understanding. Always the dedicated scientist. It's one of the things I love about you. Love. The word hit him like a physical blow. Why don't I come with you, she suggested, trailing a finger down his chest. We could continue our collaboration in the supply closet. The playful suggestion from the normally reserved Dr. Vaughn stunned him. The compound was affecting her more dramatically than he'd anticipated. What had he done? At the lab, Eliza's behavior raised eyebrows. She stayed constantly at Marcus's side, her hand often finding its way to his arm or the small of his back. When Dr. Harlow, the department head, approached to discuss their upcoming presentation, Eliza positioned herself possessively between them. We've made significant breakthroughs, she told Harlow, her fingers interlaced with Marcus's. In more ways than one. The older scientist's eyebrows shot up, but he merely nodded and continued discussing the conference details. Did you have to do that? Marcus whispered when Harlow left. Do what? Let people know you're mine now. Eliza replied, her gaze intense. She leaned in to kiss him, unconcerned about their professional setting. Marcus gently pushed her back. We should maintain some professional boundaries at work. Something flashed in her eyes, hurt, then a flare of anger that quickly subsided. Of course. You're right. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'll be in my office if you need me. Don't make me wait too long. As she walked away, Marcus slumped into his chair. What had begun as a desperate attempt to spark interest had ignited something dangerous. Eliza's behavior was becoming possessive, intense, bordering on obsessive. He needed to create an antidote before things escalated further. The irony wasn't lost on him. After months of longing for her attention, he now had all of it and more. Far more than he had ever bargained for. 2 weeks into their whirlwind relationship, Marcus knew something was very wrong. What had begun as passionate desire had morphed into something darker, more possessive, something that kept him awake at night with worry. He stared at his computer screen, reviewing the compound's molecular structure for the 100th time. The lab was quiet. He'd come in at 4 a.m. specifically to avoid Eliza. These precious hours of solitude were the only chance he had to work on an antidote. His phone buzzed again, the 12th text from Eliza since he'd left her sleeping in his bed 3 hours ago. Where are you? Woke up alone. Miss you already. Followed 5 minutes later by. Are you with someone else? And then. I'm coming to the lab. Marcus ran his hands through his hair in frustration. This possessiveness was escalating daily. Yesterday, she'd confronted a female graduate student who'd asked him a question about stellar magnetism, accusing her of flirting. The poor student had fled the lab in tears. The door to the lab swung open, and Eliza appeared, wearing the clothes she'd left at his apartment, a clear marker of territory. There you are, she said, relief flooding her features as she rushed to embrace him. Why didn't you wake me? You looked peaceful, he lied, awkwardly returning her hug. And I had an idea about the stellar gravitation formula that I wanted to test. She pulled back, studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. You've been distant. Is something wrong? Is there someone else? No. No, of course not. Marcus gestured to his computer. Just focused on work. The conference is next week. Eliza relaxed slightly, trailing her fingers down his arm. We could take a break. The supply closet is still empty. Her hand slid lower, cupping him through his pants with a boldness that would have thrilled him weeks ago but now filled him with unease. Eliza, we're at work, he reminded her, gently removing her hand. Her expression hardened momentarily before softening into a pout. "You've been saying that a lot lately. Don't you want me anymore?" The hurt in her voice was genuine, making his guilt sharpen. This wasn't her fault. He'd done this to her with his selfish experiment. "Of course I do," he assured her. "I'm just stressed about the presentation." This seemed to satisfy her, and she perched on the edge of his desk. "I brought breakfast," she said, pulling out a paper bag. "Your favorite, blueberry muffins from that cafe across town." Marcus felt a chill. "You went all the way to North End before coming here?" "I'd go anywhere for you," she said simply, as if driving 40 minutes in pre-dawn traffic was perfectly normal. As they ate, Marcus surreptitiously minimized his antidote research. Eliza chatted about their presentation, her hand constantly touching his arm, his shoulder, his thigh, as if confirming he was still there. "I've been thinking," she said suddenly, her tone shifting to something more serious. "We should move in together." Marcus choked on his muffin. "What? We've only been dating for 2 weeks. But we've known each other for a year," she countered. "Why wait when we both know this is right?" Her eyes gleamed with an unsettling certainty. "I've already started looking at apartments midway between here and the observatory." "Eliza, that's moving too fast," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice gentle. "We should give it more time." Her face fell, then darkened. "You don't feel the same way." "It's not that," he insisted. "I just think—" "You regret us," she interrupted, standing abruptly. "I've been too open, too honest about my feelings, and now you're pulling away." "No, Eliza. I need some air," she said, turning toward the door. She paused, looking back with glistening eyes. "When you're ready to be honest about what you really want, you know where to find me." The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow felt more ominous than a slam. Marcus exhaled slowly, then turned back to his computer, opening the antidote research again. He had to fix this, and soon. Hours later, Marcus believed he had a viable formula. The antidote would gradually neutralize the compound over several days, allowing Eliza's natural brain chemistry to reassert itself without the shock of a sudden change. He began synthesizing it, grateful for the lab's emptiness on a Saturday afternoon. As the blue-green liquid dripped slowly into a collection vial, Marcus contemplated how to administer it. He couldn't just give it to her without explaining, that would compound his original ethical violation. But if he told her the truth now, in her current state. The lab door opened again, and Marcus jumped, nearly knocking over the apparatus. But it wasn't Eliza, it was Dr. Harlow. "Working weekends now, Elliot?" the department head asked, eyebrows raised. "Just finalizing some details for the conference," Marcus replied, discreetly shifting to block the view of his experiment. Harlow nodded, seemingly distracted. "About that. There's been some concern about your personal relationship with Dr. Vaughn affecting the professional environment." Marcus felt heat rise to his face. "Sir, I don't care who's sleeping with whom," Harlow interrupted. "But when it leads to hostile interactions with graduate students and public displays that make others uncomfortable, it becomes my business." "It won't happen again," Marcus promised, shame coursing through him. "See that it doesn't." Harlow turned to leave, then paused. "And Elliot? Dr. Vaughn's behavior has been concerning. If there's something going on that I should know about." "Everything's fine," Marcus lied. "Just new relationship intensity. It'll settle down." After Harlow left, Marcus carefully placed the newly synthesized antidote in a secure container. He needed to get Eliza somewhere private, explain everything, and hope she would understand, or at least listen long enough to take the antidote. He was securing his notes when his phone chimed with a text from Eliza. "Found your research. Coming to the lab now." Marcus froze, ice flooding his veins. What research had she found? His heart pounded as he frantically searched his apartment in his mind. The original compound notes, had he left them in his desk drawer? No, he'd brought them to the lab. Unless... the old notebook. The one where he'd first outlined the theory, documented his feelings for Eliza, and sketched the initial compound design. He'd thought it safely hidden behind his bookshelf, but if she'd been searching his apartment while he was gone. The lab door burst open, and Eliza stood there, his notebook clutched in one hand. Her face was a mask of betrayal, eyes red-rimmed from crying. "You did this to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You made me love you." The notebook hit his chest as she threw it at him, pages fluttering open to damning passages in his own handwriting, compound designed to induce attraction response in subject EV and estimated duration, 2 to 3 weeks with gradual diminishment. "Eliza, I can explain," Marcus began, knowing no explanation could possibly suffice. "Explain what?" she demanded, voice rising. "That you drugged me because you couldn't handle rejection? That these feelings aren't real?" Her voice broke on the last word. "The compound only enhances existing attraction," he said desperately. "It can't create feelings from nothing. And that makes it better?" Tears streamed down her face now. "You violated me, Marcus. You took away my choice." Every word was a knife to his heart because he knew she was right. "I never meant to hurt you," he said weakly. "But you did." Eliza's hands trembled. "The worst part is, I still want you. Right now, standing here knowing what you did, I still feel this pull toward you, and I don't know if it's real or if it's your chemical leash." Marcus reached for the antidote. "I created something to neutralize the effects. It'll help you return to your normal self." Eliza stared at the container, then back at him, devastation warring with rage in her eyes. "My normal self," she repeated flatly. "The one who wasn't obsessed with you. The one you decided wasn't good enough as she was." She backed toward the door, shaking her head. "Stay away from me, Marcus. Whatever's in that vial, whatever you think will fix me, keep it. I'll get through this on my own." As the door closed behind her, Marcus stood motionless, the antidote in his hand now useless. He had created this disaster, violated the trust of the woman he claimed to love, and now he had lost her, not just as a lover, but as a colleague, as a friend, as a decent human being in her eyes. The irony was bitter. He had finally gotten exactly what he wanted, only to discover it was the last thing he needed. 3 days after Eliza's discovery, Marcus stood before the conference audience, delivering their presentation alone. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd gotten everything he thought he wanted with Eliza, only to end up more alone than ever. She had called in sick to both the conference and the lab, and Marcus couldn't blame her. His texts and calls went unanswered. Harlow had asked pointed questions about her absence, but Marcus had deflected, protecting what little remained of their professional reputations. "And so, the gravitational theories I've outlined suggest new approaches to understanding stellar formation," he concluded, his voice hollow in the vast auditorium. Polite applause followed, but Marcus barely registered it as he gathered his materials and stepped off the stage. "Impressive work, Dr. Elliot," a colleague commented as Marcus made his way to the exit. "Though we missed Dr. Vaughn's insights on quantum applications." Marcus nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She sends her regrets." Outside, the spring evening was mild, cherry blossoms scenting the air. Marcus loosened his tie, overwhelmed by the contrast between the beauty surrounding him and the ugliness of what he'd done. Without conscious thought, his feet carried him toward Eliza's apartment building, the same path he'd taken every night since their confrontation, though he'd never gathered the courage to knock. Tonight was different. The conference was over. There were no more professional obligations to hide behind. Only the wreckage of his actions to face. His finger hovered over her buzzer for a full minute before he pressed it, half expecting silence. To his surprise, the intercom crackled to life. "Who is it?" Eliza's voice sounded tired, strained. "It's Marcus," he answered, his mouth dry. "Please, just 5 minutes." A long pause followed, then the door buzzed open without another word. The elevator ride to her floor gave Marcus time to rehearse what he would say, though he knew no words could adequately address what he'd done. When her door opened, the sight of her knocked the prepared speech from his mind. Eliza looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her copper hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore an oversized sweater and leggings, a far cry from her usual polished appearance. 5 minutes, she said, stepping aside to let him enter. The apartment was dimly lit, books and papers scattered across every surface, evidence of restless activity. An open bottle of wine sat on the coffee table beside a half-empty glass. "How was the conference?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral as she sat on the couch, drawing her knees up like a barrier. "It went well," Marcus replied, remaining standing. "Your absence was noted." She nodded, taking a sip of wine. "I've been researching. Trying to understand what you did to me." She gestured to the papers strewn about, printouts of scientific journals, chemical formulas. "The compound's effects should fade completely within another week, according to my calculations." "That's what my models predicted too," Marcus confirmed. "Eliza, Why did you do it?" she interrupted, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "Why not just ask me out again? Or accept that I wasn't interested?" The direct question deserved an honest answer. Marcus exhaled slowly. "Because I was a coward. Because after you turned me down the 3rd time, I convinced myself there was no natural chemistry between us. That I needed to level the playing field. By drugging me," she stated flatly. "Yes," he admitted, the word heavy with shame. "It was unforgivable. I've already submitted my resignation to Harlow, effective after we complete the current research cycle. I won't put you in the position of having to work alongside me." Surprise flickered across her face. "You're leaving Horizon Labs?" "It's the least I can do." Marcus moved toward the door, his 5 minutes nearly up. "I didn't come to ask forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I understand the magnitude of what I did, and I'm truly sorry." Eliza was silent for a long moment, then set down her wine glass with deliberate care. "You're assuming a lot, Marcus." "What do you mean?" "You assume I never had feelings for you. That your compound created something from nothing." She stood, crossing her arms. "Did it ever occur to you that I might have had my own reasons for declining your invitations?" Marcus blinked, confusion replacing resignation. "What reasons?" "Professional ones, for starters." Eliza began pacing, her words coming faster now. "Women in science are constantly scrutinized for relationship choices. Dating a colleague, especially one I was collaborating with on career-defining research, risked undermining everything I'd worked for. I didn't realize." "Of course you didn't," she cut him off. "And there were personal reasons too. My last relationship with a fellow physicist ended disastrously when his ego couldn't handle my success. I swore I wouldn't make that mistake again." Marcus struggled to process her words. "Are you saying that I was attracted to you before your little experiment?" "Yes." Eliza's gaze was unwavering. "Not that it justifies what you did." "It doesn't," Marcus agreed quickly. "Nothing could." She moved closer, her expression complex. "The compound didn't create my feelings. But it did something worse, it stripped away my agency, my ability to make a reasoned choice about acting on those feelings." "I understand that now," Marcus said quietly. "Do you?" She was standing directly before him now. "Because here's something else you should understand, I've been monitoring my own neurochemical responses, tracking the compound's diminishment in my system. Marcus's scientific curiosity sparked despite himself. How? Blood tests. Brain scans. I have friends in neurology who owed me favors, and didn't ask too many questions. A ghost of her professional pride showed through. The compound's concentration has decreased by approximately 60%. That's consistent with the expected degradation rate, Marcus noted. Yes. And you know what I've noticed? Eliza's voice grew softer. Even as the compulsive behaviors diminish, the jealousy, the obsessiveness, the constant need for proximity, the core attraction remains largely unchanged. The implication hung between them, neither willing to articulate it directly. That doesn't erase what happened, Marcus finally said. No, Eliza agreed. It doesn't. She turned away, moving to the window. I keep thinking about that night in the lab, when it all started. If you had just talked to me, told me how you felt without the chemical shortcut. Would it have made a difference? Marcus asked. Eliza looked back at him, vulnerability replacing anger in her eyes. Maybe. Eventually. We'll never know now, will we? The truth of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. By trying to force an outcome, he had destroyed any chance of a natural evolution between them. The compound will be completely out of my system soon, Eliza continued. And then I'll face the hardest question, what feelings are left? And could I ever trust them, or you, knowing how this began? Marcus took a step toward her, then stopped himself. What can I do? She considered him for a long moment. Give me space. Give me time. Don't resign, that's just you running away. Stay and face what you've done. And us? The question slipped out before he could stop it. There is no us, Marcus. Not now. Maybe not ever. Her voice softened slightly. But when the compound is gone entirely, when I'm certain my mind is entirely my own again, maybe we can talk. As colleagues. As two people who need to find a way forward from this mess. It was more than he deserved. Marcus nodded, relief and regret mingling in his chest. Thank you. As he turned to leave, Eliza spoke once more. Marcus? The data from my self-monitoring. I'd like you to review it. Scientifically, what you created is remarkable, despite its ethical implications. Perhaps some good can come from this if we better understand its effects. The olive branch was small but significant, an acknowledgement of his scientific contribution separate from his moral failure. I'd be honored, he replied. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, Eliza, compound or not, what I feel for you is real. Her smile was sad, tinged with something that might have been regret. That's the tragedy, isn't it? We'll never know what might have been. As the door closed behind him, Marcus felt something shift between them, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but perhaps the first tentative step toward understanding. The truth had unraveled their brief, intense relationship, exposing its flawed foundation. But in that unraveling, a different kind of truth had emerged. Beneath the chemical manipulation, there might have been something genuine all along, something they had both, in their different ways, been too afraid to pursue naturally. 6 weeks had passed since the compound had fully cleared Eliza's system. Spring had blossomed into early summer, bringing longer days and warmer nights to the Horizon Labs campus. Marcus wiped sweat from his brow as he calibrated the new stellar spectrometer, grateful for the mundane task that kept his hands busy and his mind focused. Working alongside Eliza had settled into a careful professional rhythm, polite exchanges, collaborative problem-solving, and a determined avoidance of anything personal. They had co-authored a paper on the neurochemical effects of the compound, carefully anonymized and framed as theoretical, which had generated considerable interest in the scientific community. To the outside observer, they appeared to be colleagues who had moved past an awkward romantic entanglement. But Marcus knew better. He felt her awareness of him like a physical presence whenever they shared a lab, noticed how carefully she maintained exact distances between them, saw the way her eyes sometimes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking. "Those calibrations should have been done an hour ago," came her voice from the doorway, startling him. Marcus straightened, offering a small smile. "Got lost in thought. Sorry." Eliza entered the lab fully, setting down a stack of data printouts. Today she wore her hair pulled back, her lab coat crisp over a simple blouse and slacks, the consummate professional. "The observatory needs these readings by tomorrow morning if we're going to secure the telescope time." "I'll have them ready," he promised, turning back to the equipment. Instead of leaving, Eliza hesitated, then moved to the workbench beside him. "I'll help. 4 hands are better than 2. They worked in companionable silence for several minutes, the familiar patterns of scientific collaboration providing a safe framework for their interaction. When their fingers brushed as they both reached for the same calibration tool, neither jerked away. Progress, of a sort. "I reviewed your report on the gravitational anomalies," Eliza said eventually. "Your revisions to the original theory are compelling." "Thanks. Your quantum applications gave it the foundation it needed." Marcus adjusted a setting, not looking up. "We make a good team. Professionally speaking." "Yes. We do." She was quiet for another moment. "The paper on the compound has been accepted for publication in Neuroscience Quarterly." Marcus glanced up at that. "That's excellent news. Congratulations." "Our work," she corrected gently. Despite everything, the research itself was groundbreaking. The acknowledgement hung between them, a recognition that something valuable had emerged from their painful history. "Eliza," Marcus began cautiously, "I've been offered a position at Berkeley, leading their new astrophysics initiative." He hadn't planned to tell her this way, but the moment felt right somehow. Her hands stilled on the equipment. "Are you going to take it?" "I haven't decided. It's an incredible opportunity, but..." He trailed off. But I'd be leaving unfinished business here." He met her eyes directly. "Not just the research." Understanding passed between them, charged with months of unspoken tension. Eliza set down her tools carefully. "The department is having drinks at Stellar's tonight to celebrate the grant approval. Will you be there?" The invitation was casual, but the look in her eyes suggested something more. "Yes," Marcus answered. "I'll be there." "Good." She gathered her papers. "I should get back to my office. These calibrations can wait until tomorrow." As she reached the door, Marcus called after her. "Eliza? How do you know when it's real? The attraction, I mean, not influenced by anything external." She paused, considering. "I don't think we ever can know for certain. Even natural attraction is just chemicals in the brain, isn't it? Dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin." A small smile played at her lips. "Maybe the authenticity isn't in the feeling itself, but in how we choose to act on it." With that, she was gone, leaving Marcus to contemplate her words. Stellar's was crowded that evening, the celebration already in full swing when Marcus arrived. Colleagues raised glasses in his direction, acknowledging his role in securing the prestigious grant. He scanned the room for Eliza but didn't immediately see her. "Looking for someone?" Dr. Harlow appeared at his elbow, offering a beer. "Just getting my bearings," Marcus lied, accepting the drink. Harlow studied him knowingly. "Dr. Vaughn mentioned you might be leaving us for Berkeley." "It's a possibility," Marcus admitted. "Nothing decided yet." The older scientist sipped his scotch. "Interesting timing, just when things are settling down between you two." Before Marcus could respond, a flash of copper hair caught his attention. Eliza had arrived, wearing a simple dark blue dress rather than her lab attire. She was conversing with a group of colleagues, but her eyes found his immediately across the crowded room. "Excuse me," Marcus murmured to Harlow, who chuckled knowingly. As he made his way toward her, the crowd between them seemed to part naturally. Eliza detached herself from her conversation, meeting him halfway. "You came," she said, as if she'd been uncertain. "I said I would." Marcus offered her a glass of wine from a passing tray. "You look beautiful." "Professional compliment?" she asked, a hint of playfulness in her tone. "Entirely personal," he admitted. They moved to a quieter corner of the bar, away from the main celebration. The awkwardness of recent months seemed to dissolve in the warm atmosphere, replaced by a tentative but genuine connection. "I've been reviewing my notes from the compound research," Eliza said after they'd exchanged pleasantries. "And I found something interesting." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Oh? The chemical formula you created, it was fundamentally flawed." She said this without accusation, simply stating a scientific fact. "What do you mean?" "Based on my analysis of the degradation patterns and neurological response, your compound was far less potent than you believed. The molecular structure wouldn't have sustained the kind of reaction you documented." Marcus frowned, confused. "But the effects were largely psychosomatic, I believe." Eliza took a careful sip of wine, watching him over the rim of her glass. "Your theory was sound, but the execution was incomplete. The actual compound would have created mild, temporary heightened awareness at most." "That's not possible," Marcus protested. "The behavioral changes, the obsession, the intensity were real," she acknowledged. "But they weren't entirely chemical in origin." Understanding dawned slowly. "You're saying—" "I'm saying that most of what happened between us was natural chemistry, Marcus. The compound may have been the excuse I needed to finally act on feelings I'd been suppressing for professional reasons." She set down her glass. "But I was never as affected as you thought. But the jealousy, the possessiveness were partly performance," she admitted, having the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "When I realized what you'd done, which I suspected within days, by the way, I may have exaggerated certain behaviors to make you face the consequences of your actions." Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "You knew?" "I had suspicions when I suddenly felt overwhelming attraction after accidentally inhaling your stellar material sample." A wry smile played across her lips. "I'm a scientist too, Marcus. It didn't take long to piece together what had happened, especially given your guilty behavior afterward. And you let me believe that I was under the influence of your love potion?" "Yes." Her expression grew more serious. "You deserve to wrestle with the ethical implications of what you'd done. And I needed to understand my own feelings without your interference." Marcus shook his head, processing this revelation. "So when you found my notebook?" "I'd already come to terms with most of it. Finding the notebook just gave me the proof I needed to confront you directly." She reached across the table, her fingers lightly brushing his. "I'm not saying what you did wasn't wrong. It was. But the aftermath, what we discovered about each other in the process, that was real." "I don't know whether to feel relieved or more guilty," Marcus admitted. "Both would be appropriate," Eliza said with a small laugh. "The point is, we've spent 6 weeks tiptoeing around each other, waiting for some magical moment when we could be certain our attraction was authentic. But what if authenticity was never the issue?" Her hand still rested near his, not quite touching but close enough to feel the warmth. "The real question isn't whether the initial attraction was chemically induced. It's whether what we've built since then, the respect, the collaboration, the understanding, is something worth exploring." Marcus studied her face, seeing the woman he'd fallen for a year ago, but also someone new, stronger, more complex, more real than his idealized version had ever been. And what's your hypothesis on that, Dr. Vaughn? That natural chemistry, she said, finally interlacing her fingers with his, is worth investigating thoroughly. With proper scientific rigor, of course. Of course, he agreed, a smile spreading across his face. And the Berkeley offer? Long-distance research collaborations can be quite successful, she replied, returning his smile. But let's collect more data before making any permanent decisions. As they rejoined the celebration, maintaining their subtle connection, Marcus reflected on the irony of their journey. He had created a compound to manufacture attraction, only to discover that the most powerful chemistry had been natural all along, not just the attraction, but the complicated, challenging, beautiful reaction that occurred when two complex people collided and transformed each other. In science as in love, the most significant discoveries often came not from forcing a predetermined outcome, but from observing with honest eyes what actually emerged from the experiment. Eliza leaned close, her lips brushing his ear. For the record, I'm glad you spilled that compound that night. Not because it changed me, but because it forced us both to confront what was already there. Marcus turned to meet her gaze, finding in it the perfect balance of professional respect and personal desire he'd always hoped for. Best lab accident of my career, he agreed, as they stepped together into a future neither could have formulated alone.